So last night in all of the presentations, there was the primary model discussed of oral transmission was of a fairly passive approach, or a clear, sort of an absolute mimetic model where the master or teacher or speaker had material, spoke almost independently of who the students were, and the students received it. There's another model which I think is at least as present in the rabbinic discussion of how education and the oral culture work, which is of interaction, where the teacher and student are in conversation, and that gets modeled in all kinds of places. Classically, in what I think is one of the popular models that the rabbis created for rabbinic education is the Seder, in which the story is transmitted through the child asking and the father responding, not on the basis of a fixed text, but according to the child's ability to understand. And this interactive model is present throughout and suggests that besides the information being transmitted, an oral culture and oral education also involves a relationship, that the teaching is, I don't want to say incorporated, but envoiced, personed in a teacher. And so a student's relationship to the material is at the same time a relationship to a person. And so also what happens in encountering the material and processing the material
to a person. And so also what happens in encountering the material and processing the material, besides the cognitive issues that arise in differentiating learning things orally from learning things by reading, is the whole interpersonal interaction, learning about how that teacher works, negotiating the relationship with the teacher or with the colleagues. And because we as educators know that what a student learns is going to be what a student practices, then one of the things that gets learned in this kind of education is negotiating relationships with people. That doesn't mean that they're always good. That just as you can have abusive or destructive or non-productive relationships between parents and children, which in turn get repeated in following generations, you can have destructive relationships between teachers and students, between and among colleagues. So it's not necessarily a good thing, but it does at least present the opportunity for some kind of learning of how to be with and among people. So I was interested in the question of whether or not an encounter with rabbinic texts can do something which incorporates this interpersonal aspect. Is there a way of reading, of studying, of teaching rabbinic texts that also helps develop certain moral dispositions, certain ways of being with other people? I want to make clear that this is not about content. This is not about learning the right stuff. And we think about how ethics is frequently taught with Jewish texts. One of the standard models of that education is a value, a law is brought. Right? Here is what the rabbis say about shaming someone. here's a case. How would you apply this text, this teaching, to this case? There's nothing wrong with that, but if you compare that to, here are the rules for what wines to serve with what meal. Here's a menu, what wines would you serve? The cognitive processes are identical. The cognitive processes are identical. What's different is the subject matter. And I suggest that there's a difference between thinking about ethics, which is this processing the material, and thinking ethically. That is, thinking in such a way that the very process of the question, of raising questions, of examining situations, of interacting, is itself an ethically interesting event. And one of the things that I find in thinking about this is that what becomes important is the act of imagination in looking at a situation and identifying both broadly what's at stake here, what have I not been thinking of, where might be moments in this landscape of ethical import. And that's a kind of broad focus of the imagination. And also in dealing with other people. Empathy, not in the sense of supporting, encouraging, making nice, but the theory of mind, of trying to understand an other, is itself an imaginative act. Right? It's recognizing that the other is different. The other is in fact radically other, and the only way you can get into that person's experience is through an act of the imagination. Is there a way in which reading processes can help develop this? And there are some suggestions that there might be. There are people in cognitive psychology who've been suggesting that certain kinds of reading can be important to the development of the theory of mind. Some work by David Kidd and Emmanuel Castano. More interesting for my purposes are some critics and philosophers. Martha Nussbaum, who we heard about last night, who suggested the practice of reading, and in her case, that means reading high literature, and particularly Henry James, is important for developing ethical wisdom. But also, I find particularly exciting the work of Wayne Booth, because he is not limited and does not limit the enterprise to reading particularly good kinds of literature. But he suggests that all reading offers the opportunity to practice the moral imagination. And he has three insights which I think are particularly useful. That all reading involves a certain amount of moral evaluation. This evaluation is not binary, but looks at a range of values. And that these values are expressed in the interactions between the various characters inhabiting and orbiting the work. By orbiting, he's referring to his notion that rather than thinking about the author and the audience, the reader, think about the difference between the real author, the biological person, the implied author, the author that you can sort of guess at from what's in the text, which is different, of course, from the narrator, and the real reader, the implied reader, that's suggested by, what kind of person does this text seem to be written for? And I encourage you, if these are unfamiliar topics to you, I encourage you to go to Booth's work. He first lays this out in Rhetoric of Fiction. I'm working off of a later book called The Company We Keep. And he writes in this, our essential ethical experience occurs in specific relations, moment by moment, among multiple characters who offer and receive, construct and reconstruct, write and rewrite. And this suggests that a kind of reading that pays particular attention to the variety of interactions and looks for interactions that might not be immediately relevant can be a rich field in which to develop this kind of imagination. The Talmud, because it not only introduces a variety of characters who interact with one another, but is also written on a variety of levels, and I'll get to that in a moment, that it exists in multiple strata that interact with each other, is then a particularly rich medium for this. That the Talmud is particularly envoiced. The teachings are particularly envoiced, located in individual personae. And a reading that's attentive to those personae and their interaction then can become a place in which the readers and students learn to interact, learn to deal with them as personae, and perhaps, depending on the pedagogical work to prepare for some kind of transfer, that those skills, those dispositions can then be transferred to the lived human sphere. What do I mean by these strata, by these, what I call levels of discourse? One level is that where propositional content is being taught by a named or anonymous teacher in the text directly to a reader, right? We're familiar with this. Do this, don't do this. X is bad, Y is good. If we imagine ourselves kind of being behind a camera or watching a cinema, we can imagine the camera taking a step back and seeing now that narrator, that speaker who'd been addressing us, is now in fact addressing another character. Right? Dialogue, narrative. Some of these are actual stories. Some of these are just the dialectic that we've all grown to know and love in Talmud. But we're now watching characters interacting on the same narrative plane, talking to each other. If we pull back one step further, we see that this narrative plane is one of a number of others on the page, and that there's yet one more character, that is the redactor, who is collecting, organizing, in some cases writing or rewriting these interactions and putting them together. So where in their first frame we saw an individual addressing us, in the second frame we see multiple individuals talking to each other, we pull back yet one more step and we see redactor kind of dealing with all of these and putting them together. These divisions, by the way, and so these divisions offer different kinds of opportunities for questions, because each of them presents a different kind of relationship. Right? In the first level, that of propositional content, the interaction is between the teacher and us, the reader, or the implied reader. Right? What's the impact of this teaching? Like, this person's offering me something. How is that working? What's the quality of this interaction? How am I being addressed? I step back, saying, how are these characters dealing with one another in this story? Who's not there? How should we understand this relationship? How do we understand the experience of the people watching, the people around? How does that affect them? And a further step back is seeing the redactor interacting with his sources, and that would have been a him. What's the redactor's responsibility to his sources? How do these sources interact with one another? How does my awareness of the context change how I'm understanding the moral import of that? And though in each case we're dealing with some kind of moral imaginative issue, they're very different questions that are going to arise. And if we get to a point where we're trying to balance them all at the same time, we're ending up with a very complex vision of the page, vision of interaction, a very richly textured reading and imaginative experience. I want to suggest that an approach which encourages these kind of questions is accessible to a variety of teachers with a variety of other pedagogical and curricular agenda. Because each of these levels of discourse can be mapped to particular orientations. So that first level, the level of propositional content, that's the world we're familiar with. That's the world of teachers of Jewish ethics, of Jewish law, right? What's the content of this teaching? And so if that's what you're working on, then you can ask these kind of questions. The narrative frame, that level, that's both those people who are working on stories, on narrative, and I've got a bunch of people talking about that, but it's also the frame, the level at which people who are doing what we call text skills, right? Just parsing the Shakla Vataria. And I was really interested to hear in the discussion of teaching yesterday about getting students to read that orally, because that's not just going to lead the students to helping them figure out how the punctuation works, but also that's an interpretation. Right? If you've been teaching English literature or Hebrew literature, having students read a play or read a story or read a poem, the same text, the same punctuation, the same parsing takes on different lives when it's embodied by different characters. And finally, the third level of being aware of the redaction, that's clearly the home of people who are from David Kramer, Marjorie Lehman, some really interesting work more recently by Barry Winfheimer and Daniel Boyarin on looking at how the placement of a narrative within the context of the broader sugya changes the meaning of that. And so if a teacher is interested in that level, this kind of work can be brought there as well. So I want to try to suggest that the study of Talmud, the literature that most powerfully tries to present itself as a record of an oral culture, can be taught in a way that encourages the development of interpersonal moral dispositions. I mentioned in brief at the beginning the issue of transfer, and I want to highlight the absence of my discussion of that now, because it is clearly not the case. Stop.
That works, right?
In round one.
It works. Looks like I was right.
Yes.
Okay.
That it's clearly not the case that a skilled, imaginative, attentive reader will be necessarily a mensch. No one has ever said, I've just come back from the MLA conference, what a bunch of sweeties. But I think the groundwork is there, and there is a possibility of encountering written texts such that the skills that you learn in encountering the text, the imaginative vision that developed in the text, can be brought to the lived world. Thank you.
I'm reminded before the next speech very briefly of two things. One is Strauss's interpretation of Genesis. When he starts, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, and he asks this first question, who says this? That's his first question. And then he asks, well, does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. Shema ha'emet mi she'amara. And he goes, well, that's a philosopher's question. As far as the Bible and Jewish tradition is concerned, it's very important who is speaking and who is acting in the discussion. And then I'm also reminded of Michael Fishbane's Sacred Attunement, in which we are led towards moral imagination and moral empathy by moral empathy with text being a way towards ethics. So I think it was a very rich discussion. Thank you very much.